In terms of how the presentation is going to flow, so this particular piece of research, this is something that we're trying to do to investigate the relationship between IFFs, debt, and inequality, instead of looking at these different phenomena in isolation, but then bring those together. So what we did is we did a report, and the structure of the report is that we introduce the topic, we set the objectives, and then there's a specific methodology that we used, which I'll speak to, and then I will share the study findings, and then we can conclude on the report together. So in terms of introducing the topic, so we've been here as Tax Justice Network Africa, we focus a lot on taxes. If you've seen any of our work, you know that we do a lot of work on taxes. Now, one of the main functions of the government is to raise resources through taxes. And if the government is not able to raise those resources, especially in a situation where they have expenditures to meet, they have public goods to provide, if it's failing to balance raising resources alongside the government spending, what ends up happening is that they rely on borrowing and they end up in a debt trap. And this is the state in many African countries. We have seen how several African states have been classified as high risk of debt distress. And at the same time, they're faced with key developmental challenges, especially with inequality in all its forms. And when I say inequality in all its forms, inequality is not just a blanket term. There's inequality that exists to the marginalized, to the poor. There are groups such as women and girls that face a different sort of inequality. And it's important to look at inequality in all of its forms. Now, another challenge that has exacerbated all of this is the other resources that are leaving Africa, illicit financial flows. Because of illicit financial flows, countries are not able to raise adequate resources to meet their spending. So, in terms of objectives, what we tried to do is, like I've said, not to look at these three topics which I've just spoken about in isolation, but then bring them together. So in terms of specific objectives, one, we wanted to look at the level of illicit financial flows, and we looked at the period specifically between 1980 to 2020. And then secondly, we were trying to ascertain the current trends in the debt buildup, and also look at the state of inequality in West Africa. And we also took cognizance of what the COVID-19 pandemic has done in West Africa itself in terms of perpetuating both debt and inequality. And lastly, we try to bring together, so what are our findings on illicit financial flows? What are our findings on debt? What are our findings on inequality? How do these three things speak to each other? In terms of methodology, so what we did is, we looked at a direct link between IFFs and debt in the ECOWAS region, and then we tried to estimate the effect of illicit financial flows on inequality directly, and then estimating the effect of debt buildup with inequality as the outcome variable. So that's the specific methodology that we used in this study. Further to the methodology, so in terms of debt, what we're looking at when we're looking at debt is two things. So the percentage of the debt in relation to GDP. So the second one we looked at was also the total debt stock. In terms of illicit financial flows was measured specifically by trade misinvoicing. Now, there are different forms of illicit financial flows. I'll give a disclosure to that. Illicit financial flows exist in different forms, but for the purposes of this study, we focused primarily on trade misinvoicing. And then lastly, when we're looking at debt, when we're looking at inequality, there are specific indicators which used by the World Bank, such as economic growth rate, inflation, population growth, and foreign direct investment. So we used these as control variables in the study when it came to measurements. So to get started, now let's go into some of the findings of the study. What is the status quo? What is the current situation? Starting with IFFs in Africa. The most recent report quantifying IFFs done by UNCTAD showed that in terms of capital flight, $88 billion is leaving the African continent this year. And we've seen several publications saying that this could actually bridge the SDG funding gap in half. The money that we need as Africa to meet the SDGs is $200 billion. And almost $100 billion is leaving the continent through illicit financial flows in the form of capital flight. And when you break down this figure, in terms of capital flight, so the arrows that you are seeing on my right there speaks to the percentages of, this is as a percentage of GDP, how much is each region in Africa losing? And you immediately see why this study is focused specifically on Western Africa. So East Africa is losing 9% of their GDP through capital flight, 6% in Southern Africa. North Africa is the lowest with 3%. Central Africa is at 13%. And West Africa suffers the most in the form of capital flight at 35%, which is quite high. Hence, West Africa is the focus of this particular study. That is the state of illicit financial flows. When it comes to debt, we have seen over the last few years how several countries have fallen into a situation of extreme and high levels of debt. And our increase in debt is not just on the principal payments that African countries are making. It is accompanied by an obvious increase in the debt servicing figures also. This puts a lot of fiscal pressure. Another dynamic to debt is that our African currencies have been very volatile. When our African currencies lose value to the US dollar, it means that the cost of servicing our debt becomes even more expensive. That makes it very difficult for us to continue servicing our debt. When we look at specific countries, there's countries like Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, Congo, Djibouti, and Egypt. They're already classified by the IMF as having external debt to GDP ratios of over 100%. This means that everything that these countries are producing, literally 100% of what they are producing in terms of revenue, is going towards debt servicing. Then inequality. So inequality is something that we've seen increase. It reached crisis levels even before the COVID-19 pandemic. In West Africa, the inequality figures are staggering. 1% of West African owns more than everyone else in the region. I don't know if you heard me correctly. 1%, only 1% of the wealthiest West Africans own more than everyone else in the region. When we look at specific statistics, we spoke about how women are a vulnerable group. So women from rich families in Mali are 15 times more likely to have received secondary education than those from poor families. That's in Mali. In Nigeria and in Ghana, a woman from a poor family is 26 times, so 26 times for Nigeria and 14 times for Ghana, more likely to never have been to a school than one from a rich family. So you see how there are specific women who are not even going to school. Meanwhile, 1% of the Western African population owns all of that wealth. The figures are quite staggering and sad. Now, we've painted a picture. That is what the situation is with inequality, with debt, and with illicit financial flows in West Africa specifically. Now, going into the specific findings of the interlinkages between the three. So what we try to do, you'll see this in the table here. So we looked at illicit financial flows. We looked at its relationship with debt. Then we looked at the relationship of debt with inequality. And then we also tried to look at the relationship between illicit financial flows directly with inequality. So you understand the picture in terms of our methodology here. So IFFs, how do they relate to debt? How does the effect IFFs have on debt have on inequality? And vice versa, also we looked at what effect illicit financial flows has specifically on inequality. And I think you'll find the results quite interesting. So the first one, in terms of illicit financial flows and debt, what is the specific relationship between IFFs and debt in West Africa. We found that a 1% increase in illicit financial flows increases debt stocks by 3%. So for every $1 that is lost in IFFs, there's a $3 that is gained, that in terms of debt stock, which is increased. That is quite significant. For every $1 that is lost in illicit financial flows, a country's debt burden is increased by $3. And then what we tried to do also was establish a relationship between illicit financial flows and inequality. So from our study, we found that there's no direct relationship between IFFs and inequality. However, the relationship exists through debt. Yeah. So what happens is, when we've seen that from the study, for every $1 that is lost in illicit financial flows, the debt stock of a country increases by $3. Because of the increase in debt, you find that there's an increase in inequality, because our study found that there's a positive relationship between debt and inequality. So the relationship between IFFs and inequality exists through debt. And this is what our figures show. So from the findings, when illicit financial flows increases, it increases debt, which increases the inequality in the region. And these findings are summarized here. So you can see how the three are related. So it starts from illicit financial flows. When countries are losing money through illicit financial flows, it means they're not able to fund their budgets. It means that they cannot support their population. It means that they cannot provide social spending, and the government is forced to borrow. The government then goes into debt. And what happens is, when the government goes into debt, because of various reasons, we're speaking about the debt architecture here, we're speaking about private creditors, we're speaking about the high cost of borrowing, due to several factors in which our debt and financial architecture is broken. You find that African countries are spending so much money on their debt, and it is at the cost of social spending. It is at the cost of spending on health, on spending on education, on spending on social protection. And as a result, there is a positive relationship between debt and inequality. When a country's debt increases, inequality in that particular country increases. So it's quite sad. You can see how we can speak about these topics in isolation, but at the end of the day, they are all connected to one another. Now, let's conclude on this study. There's a huge funding gap for the SDGs. We looked at the figure earlier on. It's around $200 million. Now, this particular gap has really had adverse impacts on inequality in the region. And I must say, always say this when I'm giving presentations, it's easy for us to sit in hotels like this and speak about the high levels of poverty and speak about the high levels of inequality. But there are people in their day-to-day lives that are affected by these things. There's people out there in West Africa right now that do not know where their next meal is going to come from. It's a very, very serious issue. And if nothing is done, if we continue losing those resources through illicit financial flows, which is the root of the problem from the study that we've done here, you'll find that the developmental challenges that we are facing are going to continue to perpetuate. How are we going to finance our development if the resources that we need to finance our development are leaving the continent? What can we do? I know it's been depressing, but there's some hope in terms of recommendations if they are implemented. IFFs is a very complex issue, and in the way we address it, you can't have one nation alone. Nigeria says, I will stand alone. Senegal says, I will stand alone. No, it must be concerted efforts. In the ECOWAS region, countries must come together and address challenges of illicit financial flows, and not just in the ECOWAS region. This must be scaled up to continental level. We work together under ECOWAS, scale this up to continental level. It's important that within our hands, what can we do? What do our tax systems look like? Are our tax systems just? Are our tax systems fair? Do our tax systems take cognizance of the levels of inequality within the region? How are we trying to spread the tax burden to ensure that each person is carrying their fair share, is paying their fair share of taxes, is carrying a fair weight on their shoulders? Do we have progressive tax systems? And lastly, administrative reforms aimed at improving efficiency across the existing tax systems. How we're addressing illicit financial flows. There's a lot that we can do to seal some of the loopholes within our tax systems to address illicit financial flows.
Thanks, Isaac. Thank you, Ishmael and TJNA, for the opportunity to be on this panel. The paper was well presented, and the findings were very interesting. Just to see that every 1% increase in the illicit financial flows, the debt stock actually increases by 3%. And for us, we have done also our research on the debt profiles within the different zones. They are like East Africa, West Africa, and the countries within those regions, just to investigate the debt profiles. And within the ECOWAS region, it's we do see that the debt stock has actually increased exponentially, with the debt stock now more than 50% than the recommended limit subscribed, or rather prescribed by IMF. So with maybe countries like Nigeria, Ghana, who have the debt stock are about 78%, which is quite high. And we've also seen that Ghana did actually default because of this huge debt burden that they're actually tackling with. So we know that yes, the studies do confirm that the ECOWAS region is suffering from increasing debt, or rather suffering from debt distress. And also that the overwhelming size of the cost of long-term external indebtedness, evidenced by the growing calls for debt cancellation that we've seen, especially with countries like Ghana, is evidence of that, debt is actually a very big monster that we need to really investigate. And that the primary source of financing for countries within the ECOWAS region is from debt, external borrowing. And therefore, this puts them at a precarious position, because then, as Ishmael has said, they do have to contend with issues of foreign exchange currencies, which now, of course, increases the cost of repayment. And also that it's now really, it's a burden to have a sustainable growth, to foster sustainable growth within their countries. And what we have seen also in our investigations or our research is that when in the early 2000s, when the calls for debt cancellations had started, most of these West African countries were not actually in debt, or rather the debt levels was not as high as we have seen from the 2000s post the debt cancellation movements up to now. And we feel like those austerity measures that did come through IMF and the World Bank have really contributed to now what we're actually seeing now, and what we are saying, we should have a reform of the global financial architecture. Austerity measures that were put, like trade liberalization, financial liberalization, have actually led to now trade misinvesting practices, which are now what IFFs is actually all about. And then things like financial liberalization, of where we have a single exchange rate, arrangement, have seen that we see that these are predicated the channels or the causes of what IFFs are. So it is a systemic problem of IFFs that is happening, and now that is bringing the challenge of increasing debt stock, because the more we do not address these systemic issues, the more we are going to be in a debt crisis. So I think what would be my opening remarks at this point, and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Awa, and I'm a researcher at Africatalis. So thank you to Tax Justice and Ishmael today for having me in the panel. Can you hear me? Oh, okay, thanks. So I'm gonna speak in French. So maybe I'm gonna let you have the translator. So thank you, everyone. Merci Ismaël d'avoir fait cette présentation. Elle était vraiment très instructive et j'en ai beaucoup appris. Je vais commencer par dire que pour moi, le principal problème, c'est le fait que les ressources fiscales ne sont pas assez en Afrique. Les ressources fiscales sont loin d'être la première source de financement public en Afrique. Et pour moi, c'est ça le problème. Par exemple, si on regarde les chiffres, les recettes fiscales représentaient en 2017 en Afrique que 310 milliards des recettes totales. Si on compare ça aux autres sources de financement, par exemple les sources de financement des partenaires de développement en Afrique ou les sources de financement provenant des investissements directs à l'étranger ou les sources de financement provenant des envois directs de la diaspora, on se rend compte que ces ressources fiscales ne sont pas pour les gouvernements. Donc, je peux dire c'est que la mobilisation des ressources en Afrique est un domaine que les gouvernements doivent, dont les gouvernements est un domaine dont les gouvernements doivent plus mettre d'efforts pour améliorer cet aspect. Et donc, si on regarde encore les chiffres aussi, la mobilisation fiscale est à hauteur de 10% du PIB total en Afrique. Donc, c'est ce que les chiffres disent. Et pour moi, la cause principale, c'est l'étroitesse de l'assiette fiscale. L'assiette fiscale est très étroite. Les gouvernements n'arrivent pas à mobiliser assez de ressources. Par exemple, au Sénégal, sur les 408 000 unités économiques qui sont enregistrées, seulement 86 000 étaient inscrits dans le fichier des contribuables des impôts au Sénégal en 2019, ce qui est très, très loin des 6 millions de la population active qui existe. De même, je vais un peu sortir de la zone CEDEAO en Centrafrique. C'est l'un des pays où les recettes fiscales sont les plus moindres en Afrique. Par exemple, en 2016, les recettes fiscales ne représentaient que 8% du PIB. Donc, ce qui est très, très faible. Pour moi, la seconde cause aussi, c'est la faiblesse des administrations fiscales. Les administrations fiscales ne sont pas très fortes en Afrique. Les stratégies qu'elles développent ne sont pas assez efficaces. Par exemple, il y a des politiques fiscales qui sont mises en place qui ne sont pas très incitatives. Les entreprises en face ne sont pas incitées à participer ou à cotiser des impôts parce que les politiques fiscales qui sont mises en place ne sont pas très incitatives. Et donc, on assiste à ce que tu appelles en économie de l'évasion fiscale et on pourrait l'évasion fiscale, ça fait partie aussi des flux financiers illicites. C'est une des parties des flux financiers illicites. Et donc l'évasion fiscale, pour moi, c'est une des conséquences, c'est une même des causes des causes du manque de ressources fiscales en Afrique. Donc, pour moi aussi, la troisième cause, c'est les nombreuses exonérations que les gouvernements offrent aux entreprises. Il y a beaucoup d'exonérations qui sont offertes par le gouvernement aux entreprises qui veulent investir, et ça réduit du fait les ressources fiscales. Et donc, face à cette situation, le gouvernement se retrouve avec de ressources et donc est obligé d'emprunter à l'extérieur. Et donc, se retrouve piégé dans ce qu'on appelle. Et donc, se retrouve piégé dans ce qu'on appelle le piège de la dette. Et quand on se retrouve dans le piège de la dette, on se retrouve à payer des services de la dette. Et lorsque le gouvernement paye des services de la dette, c'est de l'argent qu'il détourne des dépenses d'éducation, des dépenses de santé qui étaient dédiées aux enfants, aux femmes et au pays, qui étaient dédiés aux citoyens. Et donc, c'est de l'argent qui est détourné et qui est payé en retour pour des services de dette. Et donc, on se retrouve à avoir des inégalités dans le pays. Et donc, vous voyez bien le chemin de tout ça. Donc, ça commence par un manque de mobilisation de recettes. On se retrouve à être piégé dans le piège de la dette. Et donc, le piège de la dette oblige le gouvernement à détourner les fonds et à payer ses services. Et donc, on a des inégalités dans le pays. Et c'est comme ça pour moi c'est comme ça que ça se passe. Et c'était tout pour moi. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir écouté.
Another round of applause for them, please. So I'm reliably informed by the technical team that we have Harold online. Can we connect him? Harold, you have the space. You can share your reflections with regard to the presentation that has been delivered. I hope you are following the deliberations.
Yes, let me say good afternoon to you, Ismail, and the panel. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Good afternoon. Let me say good afternoon to you.
We'll soon hear you. Don't get discouraged.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Yes, we can hear you. Please carry on. Carry on.
Okay. Good afternoon to you, Ishmael, and the panel members. It's a pleasure to join you from Liberia. And let me say thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
All right. So, I think there's you can see a lot of correlation with your presentation, particularly looking at the fact that every 1% of IFF, creates a debt burden of $3 dollars, particularly within the West African sub-region. If you look at currently, Liberia's debt to GDP ratio is around 57.1% as of July of 2023. The borrowing, because the government is not able to finance its development. When we developed what we call the domestic resource mobilization strategy, there was a revenue shortfall of $1 billion, which means that the government needed additional $1 billion to be able to finance its development priorities. Now, looking at the report that you just shared, it shows there is a lot of nuances in terms of the correlation of IFF and then also debt and poverty. And I think that is part of the reason why civil society activists, and I quite agree with you when you say that for us to be able to address IFF, this should be a concerted effort between countries, that one single country cannot on their own address IFF, because there is a lot of linkages between trade within the sub-region, and then also how IFF transmits across the region. So I'm really excited in hearing the data that is coming out from the presentation. It means that there's a lot of work, a lot of advocacy work that needs to be done in terms of how we engage, how we address IFF. Now, IFF means that we don't have to be fighting IFF only from looking at it from a country perspective, but rather we should be looking at IFF from more a regional perspective. Certainly, also, we can also see that IFF has also created, a lot of poverty levels, within our country. If you look at the current data, right, of poverty levels within our country, and if you look at the presentation, we see a lot of correlation. We are not able to finance our development. Our budgets keep shrinking. We are not able to optimize domestic resource mobilization. And then beyond the fact that IFF is taking place, we also see a lot of tax incentives, which is being given many multinational corporations, despite the fact that they are milking us using IFF, right? Illicit financial flows. We're also losing a lot of money through the kind of tax incentives and tax holidays that we grant these multinational holidays. So I couldn't agree with you more when you say that we need to now begin to work to make sure that we have a concerted effort across the region, and particularly across the African continent, to be able to address the issues around IFF. The role of the media, the role of civil society, the role of the parliament also is very, very crucial. We need to begin to formulate legislations that enable us to be able to negotiate better fiscal regimes within these contracts that we sign off. We need to be able to close the gaps when it comes to IFFs. Corruption remains one of the critical challenges in addressing the issue of IFF. So I think that now that we have this data, we need to now begin to have a multi-pronged approach, addressing the issue of corruption, addressing the issue about state capacity, addressing the issue about the legislation capacity within our parliaments, so that they are able to formulate the right kind of legislations to make sure that even at the level of the policy level, how we negotiate our contract and the mechanism we put in place to make sure that we close the gaps around IFFs are optimized. So I think this has been an eye-opener with your presentation, and the fact that, I think one of the key nuances that has come up is that we cannot fight IFF looking at individual countries across the sub-region. We can only fight IFF when we come up with a concerted approach, looking at it from a regional and a continental-wide approach. So I'd like to say thank you so much, Ishmael, for that presentation, and perhaps maybe we could, as we go into the much discussions with other, panel members and some of the participants that have joined this conversation, it would be interesting to sort of look at the regional dynamics, some of the nuances across the region, and some of the specific practicalities in terms of what we can do across society, across the media, and so forth, in terms of fighting IFF. So thank you so much for the presentation, and we look forward to having a dialogue around what you've just presented. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Harold, for that intervention. I should make mention that you are very clear in your presentation. We followed you closely. At this point, I open for interventions from the rest. Do we have people that would want to engage our panel? Do you have a question, a comment? Okay. Dr. Kanisile here, 1, 2. I'm taking 3. Okay, we'll have Dr. Kanisile.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Zulu, really, congratulations. It's so simply presented that you feel like you have been part of the research. Thank you for the way you have presented it, but also just for the research itself. I just want to suggest where in the conclusion you talk about the huge funding debt deficit to attain the SDGs. if we can also just sneak in Agenda 2063 there. I'm always cautious about the UN agenda versus ours. And then also in the recommendation for ECOWAS to take the lead, I think the comrade from Liberia also emphasized it. I mean, it's the sensible way to go. You can't ask individual countries to do so. But on the other hand, it's like, it's very difficult. I think it's a discussion we need to have, because this is the same ECOWAS that went to Russia and was trying to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, not the whole ECOWAS, as in the president that is very influential in ECOWAS, but it's the same president that in Africa is talking war and invasion. So I think the political aspects in ECOWAS is what we should all be fighting for. I guess Shenai ED of TJNA, this places a heavy responsibility on us to get as more MPs from ECOWAS as we can to just do that political education, because while ECOWAS really is the actual institution to lead it, but we are not sure where its politics are at the moment, you know. Thank you, but thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you. I think that's a recommendation in terms of further comment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks for the presenter for that wonderful presentation. And then, Moderator, please excuse my ignorance on the subject of debt. It's relatively new to me, but I just want to find out, when you say a country has a healthy debt, towards the ratio of its GDP, how much will it be? And please enlighten me on this aspect. When a country will have a debt of more than 100%, how does it come to that situation? Because I understand when I owe Dr. Chabalala here $100, and then we agree that I'll pay her $10 per month, and then I default, there will be an interest rate. Now, how does it happen to a particular country to have that unsustainable debt? Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. The third one, Crystal. How does a healthy debt look like? How about the unhealthy one?
Yeah, I'm also curious about that. But it was really interesting. Thank you, Ishmael, with the three intersections of IFFs, debt, and inequality. And an African existence has always shown that, right? Before COVID, with the Africans rising narrative, our growth trajectory was, on the rise, but so was our inequality. And so my question also is, when we're looking at the work that you have been looking at, and if we're centering it in a comparison to economic growth in the way the world narrative, a neoliberal narrative couches it, how then, you can't break down the master's house using the master's tools, right? So is there an alternative to economic growth that we're pushing in terms of narrative, a recentering beyond GDP in the way that we understand it, because we know that GDP has its limitations? And also curious to know if you had any feminist referencing in your research, because feminist scholars have been researching on intersectionality for years, the intersectionality between inequalities, and you alluded to it a little bit, but I'm curious if you had any specific referencing to feminist thought leadership.
Thank you. So we'll allow the panel to respond to the first three questions. I'll start with Aphrodite.
Thank you for that question. I'll attempt to answer the question to the best of my knowledge. Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. So I think healthy debt, with the example that you've just given, you have been lent 100 shillings and then you're required to pay at an interest rate of 10%, right? Of course, that will be very much dependent on your income, how much you're getting, how much, or rather the repayment period and such like. I think the scenario really is the same with how countries borrow. It is the same sort of framework that there are conditions to borrowing, whether it's the length of repayment, what is the interest rate. So the question is usually about, are the conditions favorable to you? Is it the right channel of borrowing that you need to engage with? Because you see countries like Japan or US who have, yes, they do have 100% debt, debt to GDP ratio, but they have sustained economic growth that they are able to repay those sort of debts, even if it is beyond the threshold that is prescribed by IMF and such like. So I think for African countries, it's a question of why are we borrowing? What are we doing with the money that we are borrowing? And are we really are the funds going towards contributing to sustained growth of our economies? Because even as you're saying that, we also need to recognize that African countries have been growing over the years, but the systemic challenges that we have been experiencing, especially with the austerity measures that came in after the debt relief initiatives that did happen during the 90s, late 90s, early 2000. The fiscal policies that we did engage with, are still engaging with, are very much present and still affecting how then we contract debt, and are still keeping us in this cycle of, now what you're calling unhealthy debt, right? Because now we have to contend with foreign exchange currencies, inflation, in the context of post-global or rather COVID-19. So the conditions which we were borrowing at that time, which are still currently going on, we need to review those ones, especially now as you are calling for a seat in the tables of decision making, just to make sure that the conditions of borrowing favor us and are not against us. So I'd say healthy debt, there is healthy debt and unsustainable debt depending on the conditions of borrowing that are presented to a country. I hope that is able to.
Just a quick follow-up. In terms of debt ratio to GDP, would you say 30%, 40%, or in terms of ratio, how much would you say a country should not go beyond a certain percentage?
So what most countries, based on the debt sustainability analysis frameworks that are out there, is that it should be 50%. And that's what Crystal is actually asking. Should we now start examining that debt to GDP ratio? I know there's research that is currently ongoing or has even taken place that says that system does not actually work, especially in the African context. So at the moment, the prescribed and what now goes to this analysis, even for most organizations, civil societies, is that if it's debt to GDP ratio that is above 50%, then we're talking of at least a risk of debt distress and such like.
Or maybe we allow Ishmael to first respond to, okay, there was a question, Ishmael, with regards to the scope of the study.
Yes. So in terms of alternatives to how we look at economic growth, it's actually funny that you bring that topic up, because in the previous session that we were in with Isaac, I asked the same question. So giving specific context, it's that Zambia has approached the IMF for its 13th program. And this is even after the 2005 HIPIC forgiveness. And after HIPIC forgiveness, Zambia experienced exponential economic growth, averaging between 6 to 10% of GDP. It was one of the best performing countries in the world. And not many years later, we fell back into a debt trap. And you begin to question, how is a country that was growing economically fall back to the same thing? And it's not the first time that this has happened. Each time there has been some sort of reprieve or forgiveness. After economic growth, you find that there's a debt trap. And we begin questioning, who does these measurements of economic growth benefit? When you narrow it down, when you ask, so if you go back and ask the Zambians that during this period when you're experiencing GDP growth of averaging 10%, were more jobs created? Did it mean that more women were going to schools? Does this mean that people had access to healthcare and education? And many of the time you hear that the answer is no. And we begin questioning the models that we have been using, that have been imposed on us on the, that we are using, which is from the West. And do they work within the African context? It's a big question which we need to begin looking at. Unfortunately, we used the same measures within the study itself. We tried as much as possible to balance, not looking at debt as a percentage of GDP alone, but then also the total debt stock. But definitely it opens up a deeper question into what models of development are we pursuing as an African continent? And maybe for the follow-up study after this, it's something that we can begin breaking down. But it's definitely a big conversation. And as I said in the previous session, it is in line with one of the R's that Aphrodite have put out, which is rethinking how we are looking at our development. In terms of the use of feminist writers, I can get back to you. I'm embarrassed to say that one of the feminist writers I know is a German economist, and he's a man, Stephen Klein. I know. I'm digging myself deep. Okay. No, but I'm certain that we have some strong feminists in the research. I'll share the report, and yeah, it's a conversation that we can have.
So Crystal has questions. Again, it's getting into some type of waters. So avoid delving into that. Dr. Kanisile, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you for indulging me again, Isaac. Zulu, I think it's a huge gap between East Africa, the second largest in terms of outflows vis-a-vis GDP. 9% and 35% is a huge gap. And I think I am more a decolonial scholar than anything. So I get worried when we present these technical without the politics for me. Like, have we found out why is the gap so high in West Africa? Because I think if we don't pin the problem, we're never going to solve it. And I know TJNA is formed to look at tax, specifically. But I think that being Black founded and Black owned, we still have a responsibility along with the technical stuff to politicize, otherwise nobody's going to do it for us. So I'm interested to know if you found the reasons, and if when you present it, are you opposed to even capturing it in a paragraph, even if it is, because surely there are conditions that have led to this for it to be 35%. It didn't just wake up being at 35%. So yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to speak to very quickly the question about percentage of GDP. Well, just what's considered sort of healthy debt and what's not. I was just having a chat with Sandra just now. It differs by sort of the level of economic. What would the phrase be? Well, at what did he say? So at the end of the day, sort of lower income countries, there we go. So lower income countries have lower debt to GDP rates that are considered sustainable than, say, for example, higher income countries. So, for example, America, and I think someone mentioned even Japan, have debt to GDP rates that are more than 100%. But there are never questions raised against that, because those countries are considered to be able to meet their financial obligations, right? Whereas lower income countries, many African countries, are given 60% as the rate that's considered sustainable, again, under that premise, right? That at that rate, that's the rate at which they would be able to still meet their financial obligations. So I just kind of wanted to speak to that issue.
some more information provided to add to the discussion with regards to rates. Okay.
Je voulais dire que pour moi, je voulais ajouter à ce que la dame vient de dire, le problème, c'est que les agences de notation de crédit qui notent la dette en Afrique ne sont pas adaptées. Ils jugent nos obligations budgétaires en fonction de ce que les pays développés sont en train de faire. Ils ont leur réalité. Nous aussi, on a nos réalités et ils sont en train de nous juger en fonction des réalités des autres pays. Et c'est pour ça que même si on a 50% de dette, 50% du PIB de notre dette, on se retrouve à être en défaut de paiement parce que ils nous jugent ils nous jugent parce que, ils nous considèrent comme insolvables. Quand on dit qu'on est insolvable, ça veut dire qu'on peut pas payer notre dette alors qu'on a une dette à hauteur de 50% de notre PIB. Et en face, on a les États-Unis qui sont à 100%, qui ont des problèmes de solvabilité, mais qui peuvent emprunter dans les marchés internationaux et qui empruntent aussi qui ont des partenaires de développement qui leur financent tous les jours. Pour moi, le problème, c'est les agences de notation qui sont en train c'est eux qui mènent le jeu sur le terrain. C'est eux qui disent la Zambie est insolvable, le Sénégal est en défaut de paiement. Et voilà, pour moi, c'est ça le problème.
I come from Zambia. Harold, would you want to make an intervention? Just to make sure that we don't forget you. Would you want to come in and share some reflections based on the progress made within the discourse? Okay. He's muted? Okay. 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 Can we have a few other interventions?
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you so much, Ishmael and the panelists. I don't know whether mine is a question or a reflection. I was listening to our sister from AfriCatalyst, and she painted a cycle whereby the challenges of African countries is that they don't collect enough revenues. And then because of that, they start borrowing, then they are in the debt trap. And then because of that, then they are not able to finance their social services, and again, inequality increases. But then I was remembering, I think another session we were in the morning where at least 2-3 speakers also mentioned that the issue may not necessarily be collection, but how even the funds are used. They were mentioning, for example, that at some point, maybe as citizens, we may refuse to pay some of the debt because we have not benefited from them. So what is which? Are you both correct? And then what is the exact situation so that then we know where we have to intervene? Is it a mobilization issue? Is it an allocation and spending and management issue? Yeah, thank you.
Hopefully you've taken note of that. Crystal?
Yeah, Sandra, I'm wondering the same thing. So when Kenya built the SGR, I think it was the cost of that debt accrued as 7% of our GDP. Now, how many people actually use as a SGR is questionable. The same can be said for the expressway. And there are these beautiful pictures of complete mess on the bottom free public road and like maybe 2 cars on the top road, but yet we're paying for it and everybody's having to pay for it. So in terms of priorities, even in what we take the debt for, and from a feminist perspective, if maternal health care is not profitable, we don't borrow for it, right? Coupled with this idea of a global governance architecture that forces us down certain pathways. The World Bank Cascade approach will tell you what to invest in and who to invest it with. And who decides and determines whose priorities are more important is questionable. So with a measure of things like GDP, and GDP rises as much as you privatize healthcare, as an example, how then do you, like, where do we begin? The same question as Sandra, where do we begin? If the measure is wrong, how you borrow, the priorities behind what you borrow for is also very, very skewed against us. How do you then begin to politicize a narrative of centering citizens, or I don't even want to call it citizens, but people at the heart of it, beyond just an economic growth for economic growth's sake for a very small one, less than 1% even?
So Harold, I'm getting back to you again. We're requesting if you can unmute yourself so that we can hear you, even as we give you an opportunity. In an event, if you want to make an intervention, please unmute yourself.
Okay, I think for me, I speak like after Crystal spoke, it's something that was going through my mind, and I'm hearing people in the room talk about what are we using to measure economic growth or just success as a country or as a continent. And sometimes when you sit and you're looking at these numbers, and sometimes when you're looking at it from a feminist perspective, you begin to wonder, who really are we speaking for when we're talking about economic growth? We're here speaking about development. We're speaking about getting out of the cycle of debt. If we do get out of the cycle of debt, do we then consider ourselves successful, even if we're still just looking at the numbers? It brings me back to the case of my country. I'm from Zambia. And over the last 2 years, and with our new regime, you see a lot of talk, a lot of economic growth, economic changes, everything that our current leader and our current regime will speak about has to do with economics. It might be because we have an economist leading the country, and so all they see is numbers. And I worry that even as we sit in conferences like this, putting a feminist perspective on the side and just bringing it in here and there to sort of play to what the world is looking to, is just going to get us into a cycle where in the next 5 years, Africa might not have the debt that they have because of a few interventions. But would that still mean success? Would that just be numbers? Would that be a few people saying we've managed to get Zambia out of this when we did this? But will it still be over 70% of women living under the poverty line? Will it still mean women still providing a lot of unpaid care work because there's not enough that is being thrown towards maternity, towards health, towards education? What does that look like for us? And I feel like even as we continue talking about this year in and year out, if we keep on ignoring feminist principles and the feminist perspective when we're dealing with all these challenges, it would just still be a vicious cycle. It might not be debt, but it will still be people suffering even without debt. And you speak about countries like Japan and like America that are not facing what we are in terms of debt. If we go there and we look at the pay gap, if we go there and we look at the healthcare and we look at the women and the girls who are still being left behind, we can't really just say it's debt. They're not in debt, but the women there and the girls and other minorities are still suffering. So it's something that we really need to look at even as we continue having these conversations.
Thank you for that intervention. I allow the panel to respond now.
So I'm going to speak in French, maybe. But I understand all your questions. Pour moi, l'allocation et la mobilisation, pour moi, les deux sont les problèmes. L'État ne mobilise pas assez, mais aussi n'alloue pas de la meilleure manière. Donc, il y a deux problèmes qui sont liés. C'est vrai que c'est lié, mais il y a deux problèmes. La première, pour moi, la solution, c'est vraiment très technique. C'est élargir l'assiette fiscale, supprimer les exonérations, essayer de mettre en place des politiques de TVA, parce que la TVA, c'est la taxe la plus efficace de toutes les taxes, pardon. C'est la taxe la plus efficace. Et donc, parce que tout le monde paye la TVA. à moins que le gouvernement décide d'exonérer, la TVA, elle est payée par tout le monde. Donc, si on supprime toutes les exonérations et qu'on mette en place une politique de TVA efficace à hauteur de 20%, ce serait l'idéal. Il y a des pays qui sont en train de travailler là-dessus. On est à 18% pour pratiquement tous les pays en Afrique, mais l'objectif, c'est de monter à 20% sans pour autant mettre une pression fiscale sur la population. Donc, pour moi, ce serait ça. Mobiliser, pour moi, c'est ça les solutions pour mobiliser plus. Et pour allouer, l'État doit être conscient que nous, les femmes, nous avons besoin de plus des services de santé que les hommes. Et prendre ça en compte dans les politiques. Par exemple, les hommes, ils n'accouchent pas, ils ne font pas des bébés, ils vont pas à l'hôpital. Donc, ils vont pratiquement à l'hôpital que 2 à 3 fois par l'année, dans l'année, alors que les femmes, ils vont pratiquement tous les jours. Et donc, l'État doit prendre en compte tout ça dans ses politiques. Mettre en place des systèmes d'assurance et d'aide pour les femmes et pour les enfants, parce que c'est les plus vulnérables dans la société. Et donc, j'avais lu aussi une étude, je pense que c'était UNECA qui l'avait faite, et il disait que un des signes qu'un pays est en train de s'endetter plus qu'il ne devrait, c'est la croissance. Lorsqu'on observe une forte croissance dans un pays, ça veut dire que le pays est en train de s'endetter pour financer cette croissance. Et donc, il y a un lien entre la croissance et la dette. C'est juste que ça ne se voit pas. Quand tout va bien, les gens en général ne s'inquiètent pas. Quand on voit que le pays croît, il y a de nouvelles créations d'emplois, il y a la santé, ça va bien. Tout le monde, les gens ne s'inquiètent pas. Mais derrière, ça veut dire que l'État n'est pas en train de mobiliser beaucoup de fonds. C'est une réalité. Et donc, ce que l'État fait, c'est qu'il s'endette pour financer tout ça. Et donc, pour moi, il y a un lien. Et c'est juste que les gens s'en rendent pas compte. Et on s'en rend compte juste après quand les choses commencent à s'en mêler et que les problèmes sont là. Donc, c'était...
I just wanted to respond to Sandra, and when you asked us whether we have a capacity as citizens to say we are not paying, but I think we do have, depending on the context. Because, for example, in Kenya we had the National Debt Conference, and as you know, Omkia Omtata said that we have repaid all our debts. We don't have any debt. So why are we being told that, we have a debt obligation, we're in debt distress and such, why are we still inviting IMF to support us? So I think there's capacity in terms of odious debt to say, we don't understand how we procure this debt. Then we need to mobilize and say, well, we need answers. Can the government be transparent? So there's still capacity for that, to mobilize and say we are not paying because we don't understand where this money was used. And also, I know from Crystal asking also about whether there are other ways of, debt to GDP ratio, if there are other ways of debt sustainability analysis. I think there have been conversations already starting, and it's other than putting, like Cheneng was saying, low income countries at the same bracket as, high income countries, as the debt to GDP ratio, we can start asking, can loan be given in terms of needs of a country, like development needs, what she's also saying, hospital needs, what are the needs of a country, other than the fact that they're in debt, they need money, but it's not based on the debt to GDP ratio, but actually the financing needs that they read and require at that point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Isaac, should I conclude also, or? She's asking for permission. You want to speak? Oh yes, no, before I want to answer and conclude. So I'm asking Isaac if okay. So taking into consideration the political dynamics in West Africa in terms of how they have the highest level of illicit financial flows, I am becoming more and more like you, Chair, and not mincing my words. And you know that there's a heavy Francophone influence in West Africa as opposed to most regions in Africa. And you look at the wars that are happening in Niger, you look at the conflict that's happening in Gabon now, you look at the different regions, and you can see how it is perpetuated a lot by the West and how they have severely underdeveloped Francophone Africa. That's definitely a dynamic that we are cognizant of. And you will be happy to know that I'm announcing it now for the first time outside. I only spoke to my boss earlier this week on Monday, actually, and we'll be doing a study looking at the political economy around illicit financial flows. And we want to expose and put that in paper, back it up by actual data, because it's easy for me to speak on a panel here and say how the French, how Francophone, how the West have influence and the development in Africa, but to back that up with actual research and data. So we will be doing that. So look forward to that publication that will be coming soon, definitely. And then Isaac, I think maybe we should stop giving the mic to Sandra and Crystal. The facts they are speaking, the facts are too strong. We'll host them afterwards, yeah. Yeah, because it's making me think the leaders that we have, when they do have resources, they were investing like the SGR, you've said, they will invest in the expressway in Kenya. And you look at the developmental priorities, they do not benefit the vulnerable communities within our countries. So there's a problem that we have with the way we're managing the funds that we have. There's a problem that we have with illicit financial flows, the money that is leaving the continent from the private sector. Again, we're saying that there's a problem that we have with some of these international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, such as the IMF, and the policies that they impose on developing countries. And the picture looks bleak. How do you then fight all of these things around? It's like you're David and you're fighting 5 Goliaths at the same time. But fortunately, in the Bible, David was triumphant. So hopefully, we can be triumphant in this. It does make me think. I don't have the solutions, but I really want to be the David who is throwing the stones at Goliath. And I think if all of us are throwing the stones together, it definitely makes a difference. We can hit a dent in that. And just to say, the feedback that we've received so far from everyone in the meeting is going to be incorporated into the report. I, as much as possible, want to make sure that this report is of quality and contributes to the discourse that we're having on IFFs, on debt, and on inequality. So this feedback will be incorporated, and then we'll be sharing the report with everyone. I'll persuade my Afro that people who have all your emails, and we'll share it with you. And yeah, it's definitely going to be quite insightful. So please do share it widely amongst your networks. Thank you very much, Isaac.